So today is session 2, giving and receiving feedback. So you can see there on the screen what we're going to be covering today. We got 4 really good nuggets to share with you. We will go into our small group breakouts like we did last week and give you a chance to process a little bit more and practice on some of the things we're going to teach you today. And then as a reminder, we'll follow back up for the last couple of minutes of the class. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Janet, who's going to kick us off.
Right. Thank you, Elise. All right. So we're going to get started with the kapow, which I think has a lot to do with feedback, whether or not you have received feedback in a way that has surprised you or maybe felt like a punch in the face, where you were not necessarily prepared. Or maybe you were the giver of feedback, where maybe the person received it not in a favorable way. The other alternative to this is just that supervisor that gives feedback often, is what I call like, this is like, I think actually this is a grasshopper, my son told me, but just pretend it's a cricket because I don't know my insects that well, where you just hear crickets chirping, and where you get no feedback, or where you get into a pattern with an individual where you maybe had an unsuccessful feedback session where either they cried or became emotionally volatile, and then you just said, well, I'm never doing that again. And so what we want to do is break down some of the boundaries for feedback. A couple of things that Elise and I have been hearing from leaders during this time is, well, I'm going to wait till after COVID to give the performance review or to give feedback, because, and I do agree that the empathetic side of the leader is, we got to give people time to get used to this work from home and to adopt these new practices. Many people are parenting and teaching from home as well. And so I'm not saying just give feedback all the time, but I'm saying, at some point we do have to get to a business as usual, where as a leader, you can feel comfortable giving feedback. And I would argue that really it's all about the culture that you live and work in, the organizational culture, and how feedback is both given and received. And you really want to create a culture where feedback is often and frequent and accepted, and feelings aren't hurt and doors aren't slamming. I've been in all kinds of work environments or where people just kind of disregard when they're given feedback. This module that I'm getting ready to coach here with all of you is part of the coaching leadership skill set. Great leaders know how to give feedback. Also encourage you to check with your human resources department. They may have feedback tools, but this is, although I've kind of formalized it here, this is as formal as you make it. You could just adopt these practices in mindset, or you can actually download the forms. I've got lots of different homework assignments. I love this visual. This is a woman who's giving a presentation, and all of her people on her team are thinking, in their minds, right? I wish she would have had more visual aids, or maybe she could have explained more. I really needed a break in the middle. This is too long. But then when the leader goes and asks for feedback, what does everybody say? You were great. I learned so much, even though they may be thinking in their back of their mind, wow, I'm still really confused by that. And for some reason, and maybe this is just um, our our frequency, that we all have a tendency to be nice. And it's not that not giving feedback isn't nice. I think, in fact, it is nice. If you've ever heard the saying, feedback is truly a gift. But for whatever reason, this gentleman in the green sweater didn't feel safe giving her the feedback. I think the top feedback myth that I hear often, and how many of you, just kind of a quick show of hands on the screen, um, are familiar with the feedback sandwich, where you put okay, so that's a lot of people. You do the sandwich, right? I'm going to tell you something nice, and then in the middle I'm going to put the negative feedback. But if many of you, if you've ever experienced this, if you've been on the receiving end of a feedback sandwich, it starts with nervous chatter because the leader is like, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. And they're trying to make, small talk about something great that this person did. Then they tell them the negative feedback, and then they layer it with some more positive feedback. And then the individual who's receiving that often, and there have been massive studies done on this, leaves that room remembering what? The positive feedback, and maybe even some of the nervous chatter. But the human mind will kind of bury the lead, the negative feedback. So we know that this doesn't work. And I want you to literally forget the positive feedback sandwich as leaders. I mean, yes, you definitely want to give positive feedback and you want to give negative feedback, but oftentimes it doesn't happen in the same meeting unless it is an annual performance review or something that's a little bit more formal. Feedback is really three things. It's based on observation, it's timely and specific, and it's descriptive but not judgmental. And this third bullet is really important, and I'm going to circle back to it and give you lots of evidence for what I mean by versus descriptive versus judgmental. Here's the catch with feedback. People make assumptions. So if Elise were to give me feedback, I may have already assumed about her as my boss that she does not like me. So she's giving me feedback and I'm thinking, well, of course Elise is going to give me this feedback because I just assumed that she doesn't like me. Or some supervisors will use feedback as a shield to say things that they shouldn't. And we've gotten into a lot of this, with even stereotyping, like you were a real B word in that meeting, which was obviously never appropriate for the workplace, or, I don't know why you're so rude all the time, kind of statements do not work, right, when you're really trying to deliver feedback. People bring emotions, like I've said, door slamming, tears into the equation. And, not everyone experiences the same feedback. Literally, you could say the exact same thing or the exact same input the same way, depending upon what's going on in their lives or how they're feeling on that day. So kind of coming back to this subordinate is saying to the supervisor, when you made that commitment for my unit, I really felt disrespected. You didn't ask me in advance if it was possible to meet such a tight time frame, and it's not possible. And I really feel like you should have asked me. 1 month later, the same supervisor does the same thing again, but this time the subordinate is saying, wow, when you made that commitment for my union, I felt complimented that you trusted me to get so much done on a tight time frame. It's kind of like, what's a leader to do? And it's not give that feedback. We still want to do that, but we just need to be mindful that you can give feedback to the same person one day and they receive it and it went beautifully, and then the next day you try the same framework that I'm going to give you today and maybe it doesn't go as well. Sometimes that's not on you as the leader, that's on the receiver who's getting the feedback. So today we're going to cover both sides of the coin, receiving and giving feedback. I'm not going to, go too deep here, but I mean, essentially, for those of you that were in the 4-part webinar series that Elise and I did, I love a good quadrant. I have a couple in here today. If you're looking at all of the people on your team, if you were to just go into your notes and draw this quadrant, the vertical quadrant is performance, low to high, and then the bottom of the quadrant is the potential of that employee. So obviously, your top rank employees would be on the upper right. People that are, high performers, but they don't have a ton of potential. They've probably tapped out. They're going to stay at this. Maybe it's like a level 2 supervisor level for probably the unforeseen future. That's okay. They'd be considered like a solid performer, a steady Eddie. The people that are on the lower right are typically your, younger people or people who have just started with the organization. They have, all the potential in the world, but their performance, they're not yet trained. They're missing some things in their toolbox to add a ton of value yet, but they have tons of potential. And then the people who are low performers with low potential are just underperformers. The conversations you're having with your top talent are all about the future investment that you are personally and professionally making in them, that the company is making in them, how they might be investing in their future alongside the company. Obviously, underperforming conversations are all about improving performance. Solid performer conference communication is all about how they can maintain value to the organization, because you as their supervisor, you don't want to lose sight that even though they may have capped out on their potential, they can still add value as a solid A or B player on your team, but as long as they are continuing to deliver value to the organization. And then the people that are on the far right, these potential performers, you're usually having conversations with them, or you should be, about what are short-term successes and in partnership with you and the company, that can kind of keep them focused, but very short term, because they don't have the training to work independently for, you know, months or days, which is, I think, where we're having some problems with this immediate work from home. So it kind of looks like these are the 4 areas, but regardless of where your team sits on this quadrant, and maybe by now you've thought about where your team kind of sits in these quadrants, no matter what, all of them need feedback. And it's not like one of these groups gets more or less feedback. They all get the same level of feedback. And I think that this is sometimes where we lose sight. We think only underperformers get feedback because I gotta stay on top of them, when really everyone in the organization needs feedback. So, you know, like, why, I just encourage you guys to just put in the chat box right now, answer this question, you know, why is giving feedback difficult? What are some of the obstacles or challenges that you are having when you are giving feedback? I'd love it if you could just kind of pop that into the chat box and share that with us today. So kind of getting into what is this framework, and I have a couple of really great handouts in the Dropbox today. One of them is a homework assignment that I want you to practice giving feedback. This is a model that's taught by the Center for Creative Leadership. It's called SBI, which stands for Situation, Behavior, and Impact. And this is the kind of the 3-legged stool on how to give feedback that removes the judgment and hopefully some, or if not all, hopefully, of the volatility that sometimes can surround giving feedback. Elise, what are some of the answers that came up in the chat?
There's some really good stuff here. So a lot of people are talking about how hard it's so hard not to hurt somebody's feelings, and that people take things very personally, even if you're trying to keep it focused on business. That it's hard when you have information that's hard to hear. You've got to deliver, but it needs to be said. But it's really hard. No matter how nice you could be, it's still going to be really hard. Fear of being viewed as nitpicking, a fear of being misunderstood. Time to do it, the fear of confrontation. You know, confrontation, nobody likes conflict. That's, well, very few people do. Not knowing how it's going to be received. People that shift into being defensive when they hear it, so they're not really hearing it. That you'd like it to be in the firsthand versus having it to pass it along, which is hard if you didn't like actually witness something, but you're trying to share it. Or right now where you are doing it remotely. As opposed to
I have some thoughts on that as well, on how to share direct versus indirect, because that happens a lot as leaders, where everybody comes to you, right? And I really feel strongly that you have to stop doing that. Do not allow that feedback. You really want to, if someone observed it in the moment, you really want to try to send them to deliver the feedback if they can, and put yourself in a position where you can observe that behavior, and hopefully nip it in the bud. It doesn't mean that that's always the case where you will never accept feedback from others, but one of the first questions you should be asking is, did you share that feedback with Sarah? And oftentimes that isn't the case. And what happens is we create this circular culture, you know, where the people feel that they can come to you to complain about a person, and eventually leaders, I think, just buckle because they haven't given the feedback to that person on how to give the feedback or how to make the correction. So, you know, here's a really simple way, and I've kind of truncated this because there's other parts where you can, you know, offer questions and answers. But the main gist of SBI are these 3 things. Getting very specific with the situation. So if you were not in the room or you did not observe it firsthand, it would be very difficult to use this model. And that is done intentionally, because we really want to be able to have that feedback be that you observed it and you were right there in the moment, and you saw it firsthand. What was the behavior, which is very specific, meaning you could see it with your eyes visually, or orally you could hear it with your ears, meaning you were on a call, or you're not putting a bunch of context. And I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by very specific behavior. And then, you know, the impact. So this is where, as the leader, you can speak on behalf of the people, saying, when I saw this, I felt it was uncomfortable for myself as well as the people that were on the call or in the room. You can absolutely do that, and have it go both ways. It can be, what the impact was. Maybe it was emotionally, you were frustrated, you were angry because of this behavior that you witnessed, or that it set the timeline back on the project, or the impact on the group, right? It's what are the thoughts, feelings, or actions you take on as a result of that person's behaviors, whether it's for the team or the company. And this will become clearer as we keep going. So I'm going to have just Elise do a quick exercise with me. I've modified this for Zoom. So I'm on a call with Elise, and I'm one of her, one of her client people. So Elise, what's
So
going on?
Janet, thanks for your time today. I really need to have an important conversation with you, and I'd love to have your full attention if I could. I
Oh,
have some interesting things I need to share with you, and I need you
okay.
to be paying attention.
Okay, awesome. Let's just stop there. All right. So I'm curious. I'd like for you guys to put in the chat box, if you were giving me that feedback. So Elise, how might you give me that feedback if you did not know SBI? If I was a direct report and you had not seen that
Say
feedback?
you seem you're not very you don't seem to be taking this very seriously, Janet.
Oh, really? Because I was taking it very seriously,
Yeah,
Elise.
well,
I'm
you
I'm
didn't. Yeah, you're actually, I think you're being rude and disrespectful when I'm trying to have an important conversation with you.
what? No, I was super serious. I don't know what you're talking about, right? So if I don't know what rude or disrespectful, maybe I was raised very differently than how Elise was raised. She's using some judgmental language, right? So more specifically, if people are typing in the chat box, what did you observe me doing? So Elise, if you were to just look at my behaviors versus using those descriptive words, what did you observe?
Your feet were on the desk. You were leaning back in the chair.
Oh, I was
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah, yeah. Chair says yawning and throwing a ball. Yes,
Yawning, throwing a
yes,
ball, right?
all yes.
So like, it's particularly if you're under 30 and you haven't been used to getting a lot of feedback, that is so much more helpful than you were disrespectful, right? Because it was very specific. So now I may say, well, gosh, and I'm making this very simple for this exercise. I'm not going to throw balls anymore. I need to sit up in my chair. And now I will take on the behaviors of a respectful person, as opposed to just doing my own thing, and being able to interpret what Elise is saying. It was very specific. These are observable examples of some, and I know there's a ton of content here. There's a lot of content in my worksheets from this class today, so you'll be able to, pick up on them. But finishing other people's sentences or cutting them off in a call is very observable. Moving from thing to thing without completing the last thing is observable behavior, because they didn't finish the last project. You could make an argument that that is observable. Maybe being noticeably quiet or speaking very loud in Zoom, leaning backward in a chair during a conversation. That is how specific we want you to get when we're talking about the be and behavior of SBI. Hopefully that's pretty clear. When you're giving feedback, of course you have to prepare. I think the worst thing that happens is when someone is unprepared. They've observed a meeting, and maybe Elise did that meeting with me and she's mad at me. Like, she is like, whew, you embarrassed me in front of my client. I don't know what you think you're doing, kind of behavior. And then, obviously, that takes time for preparation. Not doing feedback when you're angry or sad or frustrated. Still asking for permission. Hey, I'd love to give you some feedback on that meeting we just had. Do you have a few minutes? Or that we had last week, Tuesday, with ABC client. Obviously being honest, but couple that with being kind. A lot of people will forego feedback because of like trying to be some kind of psychoanalysis. Like, they'll say, oh, I don't want to really give Elise feedback because, she's been kind of down lately. She hurt her ankle and she can't run. And, so I think I'm going to, and sometimes we do that. But I want you to be careful if you're giving an employee a pass because you like them or you feel sorry for them. Try to step away from that and really be honest about what is really going on and how much more, or how if they've been in a trough for a while, like employees go through this trough of disillusionment and they come back up. If they've been in a trough for a very long time, really take a hard look at that and ask yourself, maybe it's time to start giving feedback. Try not to offer advice. The purpose of giving feedback, which by the way, 5 to 10 minutes, this is not a big long meeting where you're going through a whole rigmarole. This is just, I'd like to give you some feedback in the spirit of improving long-term performance. Okay, this is not, I'm going to give you 19 pieces of feedback. It's like 1 to 3 pieces of feedback per meeting. You don't want to overwhelm the employee. And then of course, giving feedback often. I have all of these words in the handout. For those of you that aren't word people, you can see that these are the kinds of words that we would want when you're thinking about what a behavior had a positive impact. I really felt appreciated. Wow, you really allowed me to be able to make a decision because of the research that you did. I'm excited to work with you every day. Those are very, very different than maybe negative words. Like when you get the project done with 5 minutes to go before the deadline, it makes me nervous and anxious and it stresses the team out. I was confused or agitated or overwhelmed or irritated. Those might be examples of negative words that when you're talking about the impact. And I want you to try to use positive or negative words in your impact statements when you're following the worksheet that I'm going to provide at the end of the class. So it might look like, Pat, during our conference call yesterday afternoon, very specific. I'm anchoring the time and the date. That's the situation. I noticed that you interrupted others and me on several occasions. That's the behavior, very specific. Instead of saying you were rude, right? You're being very specific. I felt frustrated at times, which is the impact on me, and I sensed that others were irritated by it as well. If you think about if you were given that feedback, it'd be very difficult for you to reply like how you may, most people will be like, wow, I had no idea, or I didn't intend that. What can I do to make this better? Instead of, Pat, you were really rude yesterday. Because Pat may interpret the word rude very differently than the way that you interpret the word rude. Here's another real quick example. Chris, at the end of the QBR this morning, you gave a summary of the key action steps we had discussed in order to finish our plan. I was really glad you did that. And also it seemed to bring a good sense of closure to the meeting. Instead of, Chris, you were really effective in the meeting today, thanks, or great job, that is meaningless. Good work, nice going. It doesn't, it's not very specific. You're making a lot of assumptions in the communication as a leader, in the way that you would be available to coach and work with them, which is like part 2 and 3 of this, is just starting foundationally with feedback. So very quickly before I turn it over to Elise for triggers, this is something that coaches call Jafari's window, which is this very deep concept of things that are known to yourself, and things that are known or not known to others. So just kind of using a movie analogy, it's very shared or common knowledge. So if you're General Leia, everyone knows that she is bad and in the best way, right? I was going to use a curse word to describe her. But everyone knows that, she's ethical, she's moral, she's fighting for the cause, and that, she, to a certain extent, won a lot of her battles, right? It was very shared. It was known to others, but also known to her. She knew what her contribution was. If it's blind, meaning it's not known to the self, but it's known to others. And this is where a lot of feedback lies, where someone really doesn't genuinely, the way that I responded to Elise, I was rude, like what? Or you're a wizard, Harry. When, you know, when he has no idea that he's a wizard, but everybody else seems to know that Harry is a wizard in the early movies, right? So it wasn't yet known to him. But that is where feedback can sometimes be shocking, and upsetting, and also but powerful. If it's, you know, I don't know if you know this, but boy, your executive presence is incredible. The way you command a room, that could be very seen as very, very positive, but maybe not known to that person, who you're giving that feedback to. Then you've got where it's known to self, but for whatever reason, this person does not want to share. They do not want others to know what this gift or their ability is, or what their hindrance is. So this could be, you know, Clark Kent is really Superman. He knows that he knows who he is, but he's like, you know, I don't want other people to know that I'm Superman. I kind of want to just hang out here as a reporter, and not let people know. But he totally knows that he's Superman. And then you have the unknown, where it's not known to self and it's not known to others. And I would say that this would be as close as you can get to the Cowardly Lion in uh my gosh, The Wizard of Oz, because he does not know that he is courageous throughout most of the film, and other people don't really know. But at the very end, you know, he had courage all along. And so this is maybe just a way to think about, you know, where people may fit when you're thinking about, I need to give this person feedback. Are they aware of it? I know that I talk a lot. So that's something that I'm aware of. If somebody tells me, wow, Janet, you talked a lot in that meeting, I may dampen that down. But I truly don't know that I talk a lot, and you hit me, you kapow me with that, as being rude or aggressive, it will really impede me and my ability to be successful for you, if that's the way you're giving me the feedback. So I'm going to turn it over to Lise to talk about triggers.
Okay. If you can stop sharing your screen, Janet, and I'll take over the controls there. Okay. Can everybody see my ferret friend? Yes? Okay.
I see him.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Uh, is this you? In fact, I had a trigger this morning. I thought this was such a great picture to kind of remind ourselves of that moment that we feel triggered. Something happens. Chances are you've been sitting and working and everything was fine, and then you got a phone call. Somebody walked in your office, of course not right now, or somebody popped on Zoom to you, and all of a sudden you were triggered and you felt blood rising, your face flushing, your hands clenching, where your stomach goes, whatever it is, that sort of physical reaction, that's that indication you've been triggered. And then chances are you said or did something that you then had to spend all this time backtracking to, that you regretted from having said that you wish you had not. And this is so common. If this has happened to you, you're so normal. This is very, very common. It is so common for leaders because we have an unfair share of things that are thrown at us where we're having to manage emotions. I can always remember when I was running my public relations agency, that in my mind sometimes I would say, if it weren't for the clients and if it weren't for these employees, I could get so much work done, that I'd be like, everything is wrong about that. But as leaders, sometimes it's tempting to feel this, like, wow, it's like always have to deal with drama or things that are so challenging and difficult. But triggers, I want to just take a couple of minutes before we go into breakouts to think about triggers, because they are really, really fascinating. They are clues to our values, our beliefs, our motivations, all those things that make us who we are as people. And there are a couple of things I want you as a leader specifically to know about triggers. Is that we're going to talk about the 5 most common social triggers, because there are sort of, you know, patterns that we almost all fall into these 5 different categories of things that trigger us. I'm going to teach you how to choose to respond more productively to when you are triggered. And then particularly for leader, I want you to know and understand, how do I avoid triggering other people if at all possible? It will make my life so much better if I can. So just as a quick reminder, I know this was, and we covered this last class, you remember about the brain and the prefrontal cortex right here in your forehead and the limbic system. The PFC manages your thinking. The limbic system manages your emotions. So guess which part of your brain, when you're triggered, is running the show? It's not the PFC. It's your limbic system because you're in threat mode. Remember, that was one of the 4 principles, threats and rewards. When I'm threatened, I move into an away state. When I'm open-minded, when I feel encouraged, then I'm in a toward state of mind, and I tend to think my way out of situations. So another key principle for us to remember from last week is that a trigger is a social threat. And remember, the brain and body reacts very similarly to both, sometimes much worse when we are triggered, which is why your heart races and things like that when you've been triggered. The other thing I want you to remind yourself, and this came up in the chat box a minute ago, Janet, is why do we have to ask permission to people when we give them feedback? One of the things to keep in mind is, did you remember from last week, we talked about toward and away. So the toward state is the open state of mind where you're kind of leaning in, you're moving toward something positive. Away is a threat state. So when we're triggered, we're in an away state. But you can get people to be more in a toward state of mind. One of the ways you do that is ask their permission and engage them in conversation. You think your way through that very difficult conversation. That's one of the ways to think about how you can really use this knowledge to your advantage. So what I want you to do is we're going to take 1 minute to do a quick exercise. So find a piece of paper, and this will all be in your handouts too, but for right now, I want you to do a quick exercise. And I'm going to walk you through these 5 most common social triggers that we as humans experience. And you can see them on screen there. I'll just read them through real quickly. Status is, how well you feel that you're respected and how important respect is to you, your sort of relative standing of yourself versus other people. Certainty, kind of obvious, is the desire for clarity and your ability to predict the future, which is a lot of people being triggered by that right now. Autonomy is that sort of sense of agency, that sense of independence and the desire to be able to control the things that you do and the choices that you make. Relatedness is how connected and safe you feel with others. That's another thing that's triggered a lot right now. And fairness, which again is pretty obvious, perception of fair exchange and how you're treated and if standards are fair. So here's the quick exercise. Take 1 minute, don't take any longer than that. And I want you to rank order on a scale of 1 to 5, which ones are most important to you to which ones are least. So start with 1 is the most triggering to you and go right down the list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 would be, the trigger that really doesn't matter that much to you. Take just a minute, rank yourself 1 through 5, 1 most important, 5 least important. Which of these triggers really gets you? And my question to you is, what do the top 2 triggers tell you about yourself and the way you lead and the way you show up and what it is that kind of gets your blood boiling as a leader? This is so key for you to know as a leader about yourself. That's what I always tell with my coaching clients. I say, you can't control everybody else, but you can control yourself. So start by applying these sorts of principles and learnings to yourself to say, if I understand how and why I'm triggered, what do I need to do to manage my response better? Because people are going to trigger me all the time, but they are not knowing. But I can do a better job of choosing how I respond. So what I'm going to teach you now is a quick 3-step process for managing yourself better in the moment when you have been triggered. So number 1, we covered this last week. You guys remember that cognitive strategy of labeling. It's the simplest one there is, which is, we call it name it to tame it. That's just a shortcut, which is basically this. When you find yourself being triggered, I want you to stop, think, which of course engages your PFC. And I want you to say to yourself, you know what? That's just my autonomy trigger, or that's just my certainty trigger. And by labeling it, by actually saying it to yourself, you've had to think, so you've calmed the limbic system, and you've also acknowledged, you know what? Everybody has triggers. That's not uncommon for me to be triggered. I know what my triggers are. And by at least sort of recognizing them, you have a better chance to do step 2, which is don't react, respond. So just a little bit of semantics here, but a reaction is a sort of a defensive, uncontrolled response that happens to you. And a response is something intentional, measured, and of course demonstrates an ability to inhibit. Do you remember that from last week and from the download? The PFC, this sort of Goldilocks of the brain, is where your inhibition ability comes into play, which is so tough. It's like keep yourself from saying or doing or writing all these things that are kind of happening in your brain of, oh my gosh, that person just made me so angry. I can't believe they did that. You're like, okay, calm down, get your PFC. And I always say, think, Elise. If you can think your way out of this, chances are you're going to show up so much better than when you don't think your way through things. When you react emotionally, it's always a mess. And so I got just a little tip here for you that I thought might be useful. Again, this is building on last week from the cognitive strategies. When you're triggered, this is still in step 2, where for choosing to react versus respond. When you're triggered, I want you to try to tell yourself, hey, instead of viewing this trigger as a threat, I'm going to reframe it in my mind and I'm going to say it's for me to what? Like an opportunity to, I don't know, be a more mature leader, lead at a higher level, needs to be had. Maybe it's correct a misperception and a misunderstanding. Maybe it's to be honest with somebody who constantly pushes your buttons and they don't really know. And wouldn't it be fairer, to Janet's point of giving feedback, to tell them and to have a conversation that would be more productive? So there's lots of ways that you could reframe the purpose of a trigger instead of always being angry and reacting in a way that doesn't really serve you well as a leader. So the other step, the third step, is write an if-then statement. So again, this is going to be in your homework and I have a full worksheet for you on all this, but I wanted to just give you some examples of what this might look like. So if-then statements help you in advance to be ready, because in the moment you're going to be triggered, you're going to be all upset. So if you could write an if-then statement in advance to say, okay, if status is my thing, if I feel disrespected, I'm just going to remind myself, hey, self-respect is so much more important. I don't need to worry about what other people think. Here's one that I wrote for certainty, and here's one that I wrote for autonomy. And these are good ones. You could write your own. So that's one of the things that's going to be in your homework, is to think about what's an if-then statement I could write for my top 2 triggers. You know, for me, autonomy is one of my triggers. And so I have to always tell myself, okay, Elise, your way is not the only way. You know, it's okay. Go with somebody else's way for this. It doesn't really matter. And if it matters, then you can say, but it's not that big of a deal to let somebody else be in control of a situation. So those are ways to think about if-then statements, because they can be really useful to remind yourself in that moment of how you want to show up instead. So just as a little side note, you probably didn't expect this, but did you know that a trigger can be both a threat and a reward? Aha. And what's cool about this is because if I know, for example, if I knew that status was a trigger for Janet, that whenever I marginalize her in any way, even if it's, you know, subconsciously or unintentionally, she's going to feel threatened. But if I can intentionally seek out her advice on an important project, she will feel rewarded because status is really important to her. So I thought this was a really great insight when I discovered this about triggers, is, oh, I didn't think about it being a way to really help my people and help myself if I can learn to be more effective by treating what I think triggers them negatively, flip it on the positive. So here's an example. I'm just going to give you one example. And again, this is all going to be in your handout, but I thought this might be useful to say, okay, let's say autonomy was a trigger for an employee that you had on your team, and you had some sort of big project that you have coming up that you're going to be putting them in charge of, or maybe they're instrumental on the team, and you know autonomy is big for them. So what would be some strategies of what you could do to play to their autonomy trigger? So here, I'm just going to give you a few. Delegate the what, but not the how. You know, give them choice. That's really big for people with autonomy. Encourage them to have self-directed learning. So just to give you a couple of ideas that there are strategies that you can have as a leader to play to somebody's trigger in a positive way. And also at the same time, you're going to avoid negatively triggering them. So Janet, I'm going to stop there and hand it back to you for the receiving feedback.
Did. Sorry, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes, we can hear
thank
you.
you. Sorry. Okay, so this is just a quick round the bend, and then we'll go to our groups. I don't know when, if you want to just ask in the, if you want to put this in the chat, when is the last time that you solicited feedback on yourself? This is in 2018, the Workplace Accountability Group, they do an index every year, and only 31% of employees regularly agree that coworkers ask them for feedback. So, how you drive a culture of making feedback okay is opening yourself up without being triggered to getting your own feedback, to getting feedback on your own behavior. One of my favorite books, and one of the best ways that this question can be answered, it's in a book called Radical Candor. I don't know why that did that. Apologize. Um, and it is, what should I stop or start doing that would make it easier to work with me? What if you were to ask, start with someone safe that you work with, and I kind of challenge you. This is not a technically part of your homework, but I think good leaders ask a derivative or a variation of this question. So what if you went to someone that was a peer, or maybe even someone that reports to you, and said, hey, you know what, I'm working on this module in this leadership training that I'm doing, and part of it is on feedback, and I was curious, what should I stop or start doing that would make it easier to work with me? What do you think? And then really receive that feedback, because if you ask for it, the worst thing that you can do as a leader is find that that feedback triggered you in some way and sent you, into a negative, mindset. We want to be able to receive that feedback positively. And so when you receive feedback, always remember that listening and understanding does not equal agreement. You do not have to say, oh, yes, you're right. You could just listen and thank them for the feedback. You can give yourself time to process the feedback. Obviously, we don't want you to defend or justify. This would be a way to train your employees as well on how to give and receive feedback to make it feel safe for you to give feedback. By the way, this works with clients as well, for those of you that may not have employees or directs, but it works with peers, your boss, heck, your spouse. I've tried SBI many times, even with my husband. You can ask questions. Your session is a dialogue, though, not a debate. So what you don't want to do is, if you ask people for feedback and you're like, when specifically, and I want to know, because they don't not yet know SBI, asking for permission to maybe work with you in the future. So if you maybe have a habit of interrupting people, you could say, wow, when you see me doing that in a meeting, I really appreciate it if you'd pull me aside and let me know in the future when that happens. Obviously, keeping it confidential. The worst thing that can happen when you receive feedback, so someone says to me, Janet, you interrupt all the time. Then I go outside of the office and I say, hey, Jennifer, can you believe that Elise told me I interrupt all the time? And then I go over to Phil. Hey, Phil, can you believe that Elise, that is not what you do not need to get a ratification of, okay, let me find out if that is really true or not. We really want you to try to keep that in the room as you're experimenting with receiving feedback. And if it feels right, say thank you. You don't always have to say thank you, because feedback sometimes doesn't feel like a gift. Although if you're driving that culture of feedback, it really can be a gift. So your homework, and I've got it. There'll be a whole sheet in the Dropbox that will take you through. There's like a primer with all of the SBI, all the images that I've shared, the negative and positive words will all be up on that framework. But I want you to practice with 3 different people, 3 coworkers, 3 colleagues, direct reports, whatever, and really practicing using SBI in this next week. You'll be surprised. There's a lot of opportunity to use it. And you want to do it for 3 different people, and giving them 3 different kinds of feedback. So 2 out of the 3 should be positive, but 1 should probably be critical. See if you can push yourself to try. And then there's a reflection piece that's also in the homework that I want you to complete as well.